Hey, how's it going? Gonna talk about compression and expansion. Always wanna sort of continue our discussion about the sort of qualities of the short story form that are unique to this particular form, and that the novel doesn't necessarily have. The novel has a lot of expansion. The novel, at its worst, has no compression. And the short story form has both. It has compression and it has expansion. A good comparison might be that it's like a very tall person, like a 6'7" person, riding in a very compact car. That to me is the beauty of a short story. Um, at the macro level, there is compression in what we would call space time. So compression means a sort of a pushing in, a sort of compressing, concision, and we have that in space, in how the story passes through space and how the story passes through time. Where the story begins and where it ends. Okay, there's a compression in that sense. That a story might begin way after the story really has begun. And it might end before the story really ends. A short story compresses physical space. So we might feel if we're reading very closely where the story does not go. The story might only go to certain sort of physical spaces. Um, it the story compresses in terms of what the writer chooses to include and what the writer chooses to omit or not include. A good example might be that in that story Gluttony by Charles Baxter, how the story does not choose uh, to return the doctor to a scene between his wife and his son, even though he at the end of that story is kind of reaching out for life, choosing life. He is in a sense he is alone, and the story does not include any kind of final scene between he and his wife or he and his son Rafe. Think of it that way. Um, a short story compresses in terms of how many narrators or point of view characters a story might have. Usually there's just one. There's just one point of view character, one narrator. That is an act of compression. A novel might have several point of view characters and several narrators, depending on what point of view choice it is. Um, a short story will compress in terms of what part of a character's life it wants to delve into. The fiction writer Stephen Millhauser said in an interview that and this was about a novella that he'd written, that he chose specifically not to delve into his character's sexual life. Like that was something he just did not include in the story. And so we get that kind of compression too, that a short story is really focused on a single one or two or three aspects of a character's life. Um, at the micro level, the writer is compressing by selecting certain details. The writer compresses by focusing or limiting modification. Okay? By getting the most meaning out of the fewest words, by using strong action verbs and adjectives and adverbs that truly modify the meaning of the noun or the verb. Even with a more maximal writer like Roberto Bolaño, who we get to read this week, um, he's still using a lot of compression at the sentence level. A great example of that is on page 132. I'm going to read from the top. So here's an example of compression at the line level, and also at the macro level. Before they get to Acapulco, B's father pulls up in front of a roadside cafe. The cafe serves iguana. "Shall we try it?" he suggests. The iguanas are alive, and they hardly move when B's father goes over to look at them. B leans against the Mustang's fender, watching him. Without waiting for an answer, B's father orders a portion of iguana for himself and one for his son. Only then does B move away from the car. So we have great compression in the prose. Only nouns, only very clear, strong action verbs. There's very little detail of interiority. We're not getting B's, all these thoughts that he has of sort of thoughts of, say, irritation about his father in that moment, or thoughts of embarrassment. We understand that that they see things differently through the action and through the gestures, the way that those details are staged. It's a very compressed moment. A lot happens using a few words. Now it's time to talk about expansion. Expansion happens in the vertical movement of character revelation. We've already talked about that. But it happens in more concrete ways too. When a scene goes on longer than a page or two, and I'm talking about a dramatic scene, right? If a scene is like 1 or 2 pages, that's pretty normal for a short story. If it expands and expands to 4 or 5 pages, that's a wonderful, wonderful, expansive quality that not every story has. Time might slow down, and we see that a handful of times in the Bolaño story, Last Evenings on Earth. Especially that amazing moment when his father loses his wallet and he goes in, and then his son waits for his father to come back up. His father doesn't come up, and he goes after him. And there's that beautiful moment when the son's going down, the father's coming up. It's very slow, very patient prose writing. And that's a moment when time slows down. When a writer stays inside a scene a few beats longer. When writing feels less selective, when it seems to be in touch with mystery, when it seems all of a sudden to come outside of what we're used to, outside of the story's parameters of conflict. Maybe when the narrator digresses, or when the story digresses into what seems an alternate kind of experience. Those are amazing moments of expansion. I want to give you an example on page 138. It's one of my favorite moments in Last Evenings on Earth. Okay, so here we are. It's a deeply interior moment, and B is thinking quite a bit about this man, Guy Rossi, this poet, and he's kind of dreaming into his life. This is on page 138. He must have committed suicide, thinks B. He knew he was never going to get a visa for the States or Mexico, so he decided to end his days then and there. B imagines, or tries to imagine, a town on the Côte d'Azur. He still hasn't been to Europe. He has been all over Latin America, or almost, but he still hasn't set foot in Europe. So his image of a Mediterranean town is derived from his image of Acapulco. Heat, a small cheap hotel, beaches of golden sand and beaches of white sand, and the distant sound of music. Get ready for expansion. B doesn't realize that there is a crucial element missing from this scene's soundtrack. The rigging of the small boats that throng the ports of all the towns on the Mediterranean coast, especially the smaller ones. The sound of the rigging at night when the sea is as still as a mill pond. So the story expands in this moment, and that expansion comes actually through point of view. We're pretty close around B's consciousness. We're seeing the things that he's trying to imagine about the Mediterranean. And then this omniscient narrator comes in and says, B doesn't realize that there's a crucial element missing. And he delves deeply into what the narrator can see and what B can't see. And what's revealed in that moment is not only B's incapacity to imagine what the Mediterranean is like, but his naivete, his youth. It's a beautiful, beautiful moment of expansion. There are other moments of expansion in The Last Evenings on Earth that we are going to talk about in our discussion. All right, I hope that makes sense to you all. I don't have a pug here, but I think you did get to hear the bells at Marylhurst because I'm in my office. All right, have a good week.